Okay, welcome to the Children and Young People Scrutiny Commission this evening. Just to say, this is a formal meeting of Hackney Council and all the usual constitutional requirements of council meetings apply. Can I remind members and officers, whether you're present here in the town hall or connecting virtually, that this meeting is being held public and is being broadcast live via the internet. Please remember the rights of the press and the public to record and film the meeting apply, and everyone present should know that the media representatives may be in attendance or viewing the live stream. The first item we have on the agenda tonight is the election of chair and vice chair. Just for the nomination of chair, can I ask members for their nomination for chair, please?
I nominate Councillor Sophie Conway.
Thank you. Do we have a seconder? Seconded. Councillor Conway has been elected as chair, and I will pass over the chair to Councillor Conway.
Put my hand down.
Councillor Runga, did you want to say something?
I was going to second you, that's all.
Thank you. Okay, can I ask for... Sorry. I don't think so. Can I ask for nominations for vice chair? I nominate Councillor Gordon. Is there a member to second this nomination?
I'll second that.
Sorry, Lynn beat you to it, Councillor Runga.
Okay.
It's never been this competitive before. Are there any other nominations? No, there are no other nominations, so I can confirm that Councillor Margaret Gordon has been elected as the Vice Chair of the Children and Young People Scrutiny Commission. I'd like to thank you all for electing both of us to serve again on the Children and Young People Scrutiny Commission for a further year. It's a privilege. So welcome everybody to the first Children and Young People Scrutiny Commission for this municipal year. I would like to extend a special welcome to all of our new councillors and members of the Commission. So we have Councillor Binny Lubbock, Councillor Laudat Scott, Councillor Ross, Councillor Suso Runga and Councillor Turbot Deloff. I would also like to give a warm welcome to our new co-optees. We have Andy English, who is the head of Our Ladies Convent Girls School and the Roman Catholic representative on the Commission, Monique Pink, who is our new Parent Governor representative, and Richard Brown, who is executive head of Urswick School and is returning to the Commission as our Church of England representative. Welcome to you all, and I look forward to working with you. So now moving on to item 2, which is apologies for absence. So far I have apologies from Richard Brown and Salma. Do we have any other apologies?
I don't have any other apologies received.
Okay. I think, in fact, I think I have apologies actually from Councillor Ross. Okay, moving on now to item 3, declarations of interest. Does anybody have any declarations of interest? So, for example, if any of you are governors of schools, that's usually mentioned. So, Councillor Sizer.
Got to find out the right button. Mother of a special needs child.
Thank you very much. Councillor Laudat Scott.
Was governor at Princess May School and also sat on the schools forum.
Thank you very much. Joe.
Governor at Sir Thomas Abney School and also a parent of a child with additional needs.
Thank you very much. Monique.
Governor at Mosbourne Federation and also a parent of 2 children.
Thank you very much. Stephen.
Governor at New Wave Federation and also a parent of a child at Woodbury Down School.
Just about heard that, Stephen. So for future reference, might need to see if we can get a clearer sound from you. Sorry. Should
Chair, I might suggest parents, sorry, Chair, Councillor Bramble, I may suggest that parents may disclose a Hackney school rather than a particular school. I don't think they necessarily have to state the school that their child's in.
Thank you very much.
So I think that's more helpful for parents to do.
Thank you. All right, great. Now we're moving on to item 4. There are no urgent items and the order of business is as published. Item 5, which is terms of reference. As this is the first Children and Young People Scrutiny Commission of this municipal year, members are required to note the terms of reference for scrutiny and this commission, which are set out in the Constitution. The arrangements and procedure rules for scrutiny and this commission are set out in the Constitution, are enclosed in the report pack on pages 11 to 31. Can members note the terms of reference?
Noted.
Thank you very much. And now moving on to our first substantive item of the evening, which is item 6, childcare sufficiency audit. So each local authority has a childcare sufficiency duty to ensure that there are sufficient childcare places to meet the needs of local parents and carers. The local authority is required to undertake a childcare sufficiency audit, not only in relation to the number of childcare places available, but also to the quality and cost of local provision. Full audits are undertaken every 2 years and presented to local councillors. The most recent childcare sufficiency audit undertaken by Hackney Education is enclosed in the report pack at pages 35 to 56 of the report pack. Before we start, I'd like to note that ahead of today's meeting, the Commission held a focus group with local childcare providers to better understand the issues and challenges that are currently faced across the sector, and that we have used the data to inform our questioning. I just want to take the opportunity to thank all of the childcare providers who participated for assisting us. For this item, we have Tim Woolridge, who is the Early Years Strategy Manager, and we also have Donna Thomas, who is the Head of Early Years and Early Help. And sorry, I haven't got the grid screen on. Do we have, so we don't have Annie Gammon, the Director of Education, but I'm sure everybody else will be able to.
I think Annie's going to be joining us a little bit later. She's unwell.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so we have 40 minutes for this item. I'm going to try this municipal year to be a lot stricter with everybody around presentations and questioning. So I'm going to ask officers to sum up key issues from the report, and we've got 5 minutes for that. So taking us up to 7:15, please. So handing over now, presumably to Donna.
Yes,
Chair, I just wanted to jump in quickly because I'm conscious that new members may not have sort of met me in this capacity before as the lead member for families, of which a large part of my work is focused on early years and also on special educational needs and disabilities, and also family support, which is a key part of the sort of the early help aspect of the work we do through our children's centres and further beyond. And I did want to take the opportunity really to sort of say that the childcare sufficiency assessment is, I'm conscious, something that members may have been very interested in and anticipating seeing the outcomes of this assessment. It provides a snapshot, and obviously things can change, but you know, I think it's clear that there is sufficient available capacity across age groups and across our children's centre areas or clusters at this time. And obviously Donna and Tim will go into the detail of that. I'm really pleased to see that the quality of childcare has been maintained at good or outstanding. And I think it's worth noting for members that we are picking up questions that were raised last year around sufficiency and around our childcare offer in 2 ways through our manifesto commitments. One is looking at making best use of our children's centres and the moves that the government has made around family hubs, and we'll be going into that in more detail in the coming months. And the other is to set up an affordable childcare commission, because whilst I hope you'll see in the paper that we benchmark well against other boroughs in terms of the costs of our childcare provision, I think there is a much bigger conversation to be had about what is actually affordable childcare. But I'll hand over to officers to take you through the paper. I just want to make sure everyone knew who I was. Thanks.
Thank you. And it's a good point, actually, Councillor Woodley, because people are new to the Commission. I think it would be helpful if, when each of us speak, if we can just introduce ourselves to everybody else, so that we know who you are and we can begin to put face to names. So thank you very much for that. So now handing over to Donna.
Thank you. I don't have anything to add, Councillor Conway and Councillor Woodley. You've summed it up beautifully. So Tim, who has done the report, will take members through that report, and we'll both answer any questions that may emerge from it. I think the only thing I want to say is the template that we have used in terms of the content and the areas that we've looked at are the areas that we're required to look at, and it's the same template and the same focus areas that all local authorities have been looked at, because we've been given the same template to use. So just wanted to put that into context for you, and I'm going to hand over to Tim, who I believe is in the Town Hall.
Thank you very much, Donna. Tim.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Donna. Yeah, good evening. My name is Tim Waldridge. I'm the Early Years Strategy Manager at Hackney Education. And I'll just go through one or two of the salient points from this report. As has already been said by Councillor Conway, that Hackney Council has a duty to ensure there's sufficient childcare places. This is the report that seeks to establish whether or not there are sufficient childcare places. But just a tiny little bit of background: when we're talking about childcare places, we're mainly talking about enabling parents to access their free entitlement. So there are various types of free entitlements. There's the universal entitlement for 3 and 4 year olds. That's where everyone gets 15 hours of free education. Some 3 and 4 year olds get 30 hours of free education. If both parents or lone parent is working, you need to fulfill certain criteria to get a 30-hour place. And then there's 15 hours of free education entitlement for 2 year olds. But the 2 year old eligible criteria is low income or in receipt of various benefits, including job seekers allowance, etc., etc. So essentially, you get a 15-hour place for a 2 year old if you're a low income family. And you can claim that those free hours at a whole range of different providers. And this report seeks to sort of separate them out a little bit. We've got childminders, of which there are 163 childminders. Childminders are great because what they do is they offer a broader provision: early mornings, late into the evenings, weekends. It's a home-based childcare, and we've got lots of childminders in Hackney, 163. Then we've got private or voluntary nurseries, and there are 108 of them. Within the private and voluntary category, I include children's centres and playgroups, because they both provide daycare. Most of the private and voluntary sector and children's centres provide childcare for 50 weeks a year, from 8 in the morning till 6 in the evening. Playgroups are a bit different. They operate term time only, and they usually offer sessional care, 15 hours. So usually it's either 3 hours in the morning or 3 hours in the afternoon. We've got 21 independent schools that provide free entitlement places, and we've got 54 maintained schools with nursery classes, and a couple of maintained nursery schools as well. Approximately 25% of our schools do take children from the age of 2. So our report seeks to establish whether or not there's sufficient childcare across each of those types of providers, across different age groups. So we separate the report out to say, are there enough places for 0 to 2 year olds, for the 2 year olds, and for the 3 to 5 year olds? And are there sufficient places across different parts of Hackney? And the report presents it by children's centre area, A, B, C, D, E, and F, which are from the north and the centre and the south of the borough. And the report basically, in summary, says, yes, we do have sufficient childcare to meet the needs across Hackney, or any perceived future needs, across each different type of provider, and with each and across all of Hackney. There are plenty of places. The information obtained comes from providers themselves. They reported to us what their occupancy rates were and what their vacancies were. So this is a self-reported system. We got a pretty healthy return from the providers. Around 50% of childminders responded to our survey, 90% of our voluntary and voluntary independent private sector, and almost 100% of schools returned the information. So we can be pretty confident that it's robust in identifying where the vacancies are and for which age group. So that's great. The other thing is that was mentioned on was about looking at the cost of childcare. So we also got providers to report. Well, let me just do a little bit about cost, because obviously there's 15 hours of free childcare, and the money for the free childcare comes via Hackney Education. It goes to settings based on every hour that a child who is eligible attends. But if you want to attend for longer than your free entitlement hours, providers set fees that parents pay. And what we did is we collected all the information on how much parents are paying for fees. We broke it down into under 2s, 2-year-olds, and 3 to 5-year-olds. The broad picture is that the cost of childcare has gone up over the last 2 years. It is now approximately, can't remember, £323 for a full-time place for a child under 2 in a Hackney setting. That's the average. So it's gone up since the last report 2 years ago. It is still lower than inner London averages, but it's significantly higher than the national cost of childcare. And the same is mirrored through the other age groups that we looked into. Interestingly enough, the average cost of a full-time place, a childminder, has reduced.
Sorry, Tim, can I ask you to wrap up?
Speed up a bit.
Yes, please.
No problem.
You've gone over your 5 minutes. I'm still being a bit generous here, but
well, I'll finish. No, I'll say one last thing.
One last thing,
it's
please.
already been mentioned by Councillor Woodley. Obviously, we want to ensure that the places where you can access your free entitlement are of good quality. Quality is assessed by Ofsted, and Ofsted are very clear that we're around 96% of our settings are good or outstanding. It compares favourably with national outcomes. So, sorry for going over.
That's okay. Thank you so much for that. It's really helpful. So now we're going to go over to the Commission for some questions. So we'll take 2 at a time, if that's okay with you. You might need a pen and paper. And again, Commission, if we could keep questions as succinct, no statements, please. Handing over to Jo, I think you've got a couple of questions that you wanted to ask.
Thank you, Chair. So 2 parts to this question, both related. From our consultation with early years childcare providers, it was clear that there is a recruitment crisis in childcare, and many are really struggling to find appropriately qualified staff. And one of the things, when we drilled into that came out, was that there is often a mismatch in the training and curriculums of our local colleges and what was appropriate in the local childcare sector. This has resulted in fewer potential recruits having the early years foundation stage qualification or having less practical experience in childcare settings. So my question was, in its role as an education and training provider and or commissioner, what is the council able to do to increase the number of suitably qualified staff? Is there not a piece of work that could be done around in collaboration with our local training providers to make sure we're matching qualifications with local need? And then slightly expanding on that, one of the other things that came out of our consultation was a query around whether all early years providers are routinely included in all the training offers from Hackney Education and consultations. For example, the recent consultation on the SEND green paper. I'm not sure all early years settings were included in that, and in the universal offers of things like unconscious bias training.
So handing over to you, Tim.
You might have to follow up on one or two of those questions if I don't answer them. So I suppose the first question is around the challenges that settings are facing, and one of the specific challenges is around recruitment. So forgive me about that. There are actually a number of other challenges which I suppose are going to be picked up, and different. I think I started by saying there are different types of providers. There are childminders, there are schools, there are private and voluntary, and there are independent sector nurseries. We're not finding the same recruitment challenges with childminders. We're not finding the same recruitment challenges in the independent sector or in the maintained sector. They face other challenges around actually there being fewer children around, and therefore there being some classes that are empty, and that produces sustainability issues going on. And there are a number of play groups with significant sustainability issues because they're not getting the children. So it's not all settings that are struggling with staffing. But yes, I do agree that we are getting lots of feedback from providers saying that recruitment and retention is a challenge. There are childcare practitioners who are leaving their jobs because they're finding better paid employment elsewhere. There is a demand for well-qualified level 3 practitioners elsewhere outside the childcare market. I think childcare is it's very demanding, it's very challenging, and I think COVID has been a particularly difficult time for lots of providers, lots of practitioners. So people are leaving at a greater rate than they have been in the past. So there hasn't been the demand for staff. So the demand for staff wasn't there before, but it is now. So there's more settings wanting more staff at a shorter notice. But to your specific question, therefore, about what are we doing to support providers to recruit more staff, there's a couple of small projects that we're undergoing. We're working with settings to develop volunteering programs where we're getting parents and volunteers into settings, almost like a work experience. And then hopefully that can lead on to in-house training and practitioners obtaining the relevant qualifications. So we're trying to beef up the volunteering. We have we haven't set it in motion yet, but we are looking to work with Hackney College in order to see if we can develop a placement strategy. What we're not finding is people coming out of college or needing experience are getting the experience they need when they need it. So I think we've got a sort of perfect storm of recruitment, and it is a strategy that we're looking to develop about how we can support providers. I think the next question was about access to training for all providers. We do still continue to offer a universal training program, which is all online. It's all advertised. We send brochures out to all the settings every year, outlining the health and safety courses that we deliver, covering things like pediatric first aid and food hygiene, health and safety stuff. We also have a whole range of courses to do with learning and development, supporting children with special educational needs, speech and language therapy, delivers training, and we run safeguarding training for all providers. We do provide bespoke training to individual settings on a whole range of subjects should they wish to access that training. We offer attachment and trauma training free of charge to all providers. We have a fundamental belief that if you're working with children, you need to understand attachment, how attachment works, what it is, and we need settings to understand the impact of trauma on children's self-regulation, behaviour, learning and development, and how best to work with children and families. So we run various free training. We run training for all managers. We run termly events for every manager. They're free to attend, where we provide briefings and information updates around a whole range of topics that all providers are free to attend. We run specific training within the Haredi community. We run separate training for men, and we run separate training for women, and we run it out of the Interlink offices in Stamford Hill. It happens termly. I think actually we're running the second one this term on Wednesday. So we run an awful lot of training. Much of it is free. Some of it is traded if people want us to run inset days or evening sessions. I think that was everything.
Yes, thank you very much, Tim. I'm going to hand over to other members of the Commission for further questions. Just to be mindful, we've got 20 minutes left for this item, so if we can be brief with questions and responses. So we have a question.
Conway, sorry, can I just add to that?
Oh, sorry, Donna.
Sorry, just wanted to say that we actually have an annual early years conference, and on the back of the anti-racist conference that we had in Children and Education, the next conference, which always takes place in the spring term, will be looking at anti-racist practice. So I think it has come up because one of the providers has also contacted me that she's done the unconscious bias training and could we roll it out. But as Tim has said, we refresh the programme every year for the new academic year. And then build on what the emerging needs are. So we are looking at that as part of the annual conference, which will take place early next year. I think the other thing around the qualification, just to move very quickly, because I know that we've overstepped the timeline here, is that we used to have lots of DFE funding to support level 4 qualifications and beyond, and we've not had that funding for some time. However, the DFE are looking at workforce development, and they are looking at a whole new qualifications offer, which will come forth. But needless to say, what's happening is private providers in particular are training up new staff, and then those staff are going to get jobs in schools or maintained sector, A, because they get paid more money, and B, because possibly they get the school holidays. So I think that is what's happening at the moment, and we think that's partly merging through COVID, but partly people are making choices about where they work. So we're very aware of those issues and thinking about how we can support. I just wanted to add those 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Woodley, was it a really brief contribution, please?
I was going to pick up on the annual meeting as well, and just generally the professional development network that Tim chairs, offering sort of best practice and sort of innovation across different settings. There's a lot of kind of professional support across the private, voluntary and independent sector. And I don't think anyone answered Joe's question around engagement with the Send Green paper. So just to say that there have been 2 sort of professional engagement events with that paper, with breakout groups. I know certainly the leads of our maintained nursery settings were invited to those, along with many other staff. I will check whether there was a wider offer than that. We also had a Send Inclusion conference last week with all the Senkos and senior leadership team, and there were aspects of the Send Green paper that ties into family hubs. So we'll be revisiting the implications of that as well in future meetings. I'm really happy to organise something if there's a sense that some settings have been overlooked.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take another 2 questions. So I'm going to go to Lynn and then Councillor Trout, and then Caroline Selman. Councillor Selman, used to the formalities. Hey, it's only been a couple of months. Okay. Councillor Trout.
Thank you, Chair. The Council has a priority to develop and strengthen its early help offer And yet the feedback from the providers was there were really significant problems in getting early help to children with special educational needs. They reported things like a long waiting list for portage, delays getting specialist appointments, very complex EHCP processes, the final packages support not covering the full costs. And limited access to additional resources to support children, with on child protection plans or children in need. So around that, could you explain a bit more about how the Inclusion Fund is allocated, and whether or not there's been any increase in that fund in particular? How the council is developing access to local childcare specialists, to enable to speed up the processes, for the providers. Also, it seems the providers aren't compensated in any way for the time taken to produce, to support the assessments, to go through the assessment process. And we understand that in other authorities, some compensation is offered. So we're wondering whether any consideration was being given to that, doing the same in Hackney. Whether the role of the area SENCO, and whether any additional funding could be made available to support vulnerable children in these settings above the general, childcare funding rate. Thank you.
I'm not going to bring in Councillor Selman. I'm going to let you answer those questions because I think that might be enough for you, although they're all connected somewhat. And then we'll have another round, please. So if you could be brief, please.
As quick as possible. Right, thanks. You started off by mentioning the Early Years Inclusion Fund. For those of you who are unaware, the Early Years Inclusion Fund is a fund of money which is to support children with emerging special educational needs to be able to access early years, their early years entitlements. So those children who are entitled to funded 2, 3 or 4-year-olds, where a setting identifies that there may be some emerging special educational need, but there has not yet been a diagnosis, the setting needs to apply to that fund. The setting needs to gather the evidence to support the application, and they need to submit that application. It goes to a panel. The panel assesses the needs of the child according to what it is the setting has said, in support of the area SENCO who's supported with the application, and then the money goes to support that setting to pay for any additional staffing or any additional resources or training that might be needed to support that child to access their entitlement. The applications go into that fund termly, and the money is then allocated to a setting on a term-by-term basis for that child. It is then the setting's responsibility to continue to support that child, observe that child, and if they feel that that child meets the threshold for an application to an EHC, for an EHC plan, the setting completes that application. It is the setting's responsibility to I hear what you're saying about what can we do to support the setting to make the application, what can we do to support the setting. There is an area SENCO team that will support settings, but they're very thin. It's a very small team, and it is the setting's responsibility to make the applications alongside the parents, who obviously need to consent to any application that goes in. More money is being spent each year on meeting the needs of children, because each year, as it says in this report, each term there are more and more applications to that Early Years Inclusion Fund. In terms of the other part of your question, which was around compensating for the cost of making those applications. We can't be, there's no budget that I'm aware of that can be used to pay the setting manager or the setting Senko to complete that application and gather the evidence to support an application. But I'm very happy to look into it and see if the inclusion team could provide additional support in that area when it comes to making applications. I think there was some stuff about difficulty in accessing support services around portage, specialist teacher. I'm not really sure I'm equipped to answer that question, because the support sits with the early support team and the inclusion service. But Donna may be able to come back.
Yeah, can I? Yeah, if I just add quickly, I would say that just to add and extend a little bit what Tim has said, they're supported by the early years team, Tim's team, as well as the early years the SENS team. However, the Inclusion Fund is specifically for children with emerging need. It's not to support children through an education, health and care plan. So, and we've actually benchmarked how much they receive for the children that they have in comparison to neighbours, other neighbouring local authorities. And actually they're quite well resourced, that we're having to review and reflect so that we are more in line with other local authorities. And certainly what's happening is once there is an education, health and care plan, they actually get less for the plan than they do for children with emerging needs. So we're having to review all of that just to make sure there's a bit of consistency in children moving from the Inclusion Fund to an education, health and care plan, and so they don't receive less resources. So we're having to relook at that, but it is generous in comparison to other local authorities, and it's generous in comparison to the rates that they might get with an actual plan. So it's very much on the agenda. In terms of the early years curriculum foundation stage, or the foundation stage curriculum, there is an expectation that we see children and that we support all of their needs, and all providers, whether they be school, private nurseries, children's centres, are expected to do that. And that's why the PDN, the professional development networks that Councillor Woodley mentioned earlier, become really important, as is we still have a team of early years advisory teachers, of which Tim manages, that works very closely with the settings, supporting them to to help all children to reach the curriculum. Because their ratios are so much smaller at the moment, actually most children can be supported to meet the curriculum without necessarily having a one-to-one worker, which sometimes is needed. So it is about treating children as individuals, as unique children, and thinking about, okay, how do we support children with additional needs to reach the curriculum and to support their development, and just continue to review that. I think the other thing that came up was children on a SIN and a CP plan. We have an early years panel, a SIN panel, which is chaired by one of our children and family service managers, along with an early years service manager. And so children, I'd like to believe that every child with an allocated social worker is supported to access provision. It's about how we then work with those settings to then support the needs of the children or some of the presenting needs. And our early help system does work with some of those settings, but clearly what's coming out sometimes is that actually the demands are far more than the resources they've got to manage, which is why we're saying actually if children need and the families need a bit more support, actually let's try and place them within our children's centres, because they have additional resources to support children, parenting and families who may need a bit more time and resources to build their resilience.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask, do we know what the total budget is for the Inclusion Fund, and whether it's increased? Because I think what we were hearing is that the settings are experiencing quite a significant increase in the needs of the children that they're working with, the pandemic babies, as they're often referred to. So what is the budget?
So the budget is just under £1 million. The budget 2 years ago was think under 900,000. So the budget itself has gone up and the demand for it has increased significantly. I think last year there was, I don't think we haven't supported any child that's made an application for support and the evidence was provided to inform the decision. So I think everyone that's made an application provided the evidence that in order to support the child appropriately with the resources that's required, I think has received funding. I think in terms of additional funding, they won't receive additional funding because actually when we benchmarked across other local authorities, we're already paying our rates are already higher than other local authorities, and it's actually higher than they would get for a plan. So I don't think increasing it is the issue. The issue is, yes, across the whole sector, which I presume is why some are choosing to leave the sector. They're low-paid staff who are expected to do quite a lot in terms of workforce development, the commitment, the demands, with very little remuneration for the work that they do. And so it's the whole thing. We have got children who are coming in, they've been at home for 18 months, nearly 2 years. They're not necessarily ready for a setting. They may be slightly, I don't want to say the developmentally delayed, they've just not been socialised, and they will catch up quite quickly with the right support and the right input. But that does put a challenge in terms of how you then manage the curriculum, manage children to be able to access the curriculum and actually to support their individual needs. And I think that's the issue, supporting their individual needs. So there is a concern that the government's currently consulting on ratios, and if those ratios are reduced, it will only compound the matter. You'll have more children requiring more staff time, and it will just impact on their ability to meet the needs of all children.
Thank you very much, Donna. We're going to move on to some more questions. I'd like to try and squeeze in another 5 questions before we finish this item. So again, could everybody please be brief? I'm just taking a couple from the who are logged on remotely, and then I will come to you in the chamber. So can I have Councillor Binny Lubbock and Councillor Selman first, and then Councillor Binny Lubbock, please.
Thanks. This actually follows on from Councillor Troughton's question, but with more of a specific focus on speech and language therapy, noting that I think that was flagged up as being sort of the primary need in terms of kids with SEND needs, and also I'm aware it's something that tends to crop up further down the line in terms of a risk factor where things aren't identified early on. There was a couple of things I wanted to ask. The first was in the sort of information gathering session, one of the things that was picked up on was in delays in terms of getting appointments with speech and language therapists and also other professionals. And I was wondering if you had any data, or if not, if you would be able to subsequently provide data to the Commission on the current length of those delays, any detail on stuff that's being done to try and shorten the length of wait for an appointment. And then the other thing I just wanted to touch on is that my understanding is that before the pandemic, just thinking about the ease of access to support through the Let's Get Hackney Talking initiative, I think there was a sort of walk-in, drop-in sort of support session that was run for speech and language therapy, which was switched to appointment only and a requirement for a formal referral during the pandemic. And I just wanted to check whether there was any intentions to go back to that drop-in service, and if not, why not? That's all. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Selman. Councillor Binny Lubbock.
Yeah, my question was more around the overall financial crisis that seems to be impacting the childcare providers and their sort of ongoing sustainability. You mentioned the costs for additional hours were lower than the inner London average, but I was wondering how that relates to Hackney's comparative sort of deprivation levels. Obviously, house prices are influencing the rate setting scores, and I understand that's quite a complex formula, but obviously there are some very affluent homeowners, but I know from my own world there are large areas of deprivation as well, and the providers were telling us that the free places doesn't actually cover the actual cost, especially when providers are having to fill positions with agency staff and spend money on repeated job advertising, and we were told by providers that paid hours was subsidising the free hours, which squeezes those in the middle most. In addition, providers are experiencing a delay in getting the rates set so that they can budget for the rest of the year. I'm just wondering, considering this, financial crisis, in the context of the wider cost of living crisis, what ideas can we bring to the table to help support their sustainability going forward? You know, ideas like was suggested, maybe business rate reductions, something like that.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Donna. Tim, not sure who'd like to come in.
If I just take that, and then Tim can add anything that I might have forgotten or not aware of. So yes, absolutely. So there is a delay, speech with all the therapists, occupational health therapists, physiotherapists, speech and language therapists, CANS, mental health services. Coming out of COVID, there is an absolute delay of between 18 months to 2 years. Pre-COVID, there wasn't. There was an emerging waiting list, but nothing as significant as this. So that's a real issue, and it's an issue that we look at and we discuss at a strategic level in terms of understanding it. And I think I have to still say that COVID hasn't gone away, so we still have colleagues who are off sick and Annie with COVID. And that's still impacting, and long COVID is also an impact. So it's a real issue, and it's an issue that comes up time and time again, and we're asking about that as well. And for some children, it's severe, because if you don't get the input very quickly, then things just escalate. And you know, where you could maybe address issues, you're having to wait for some time. So we're all really, really concerned about that. But that is the reality right now. And they are starting to look at that. So things like, you know, where they would go to meetings, they have days where actually it's just a family's day, a children's day. So they've told all their professionals, all their colleagues, we're not attending meetings on these days at these times, because we're seeing patients, we're seeing families, in order to try and deal with the backlog. And yes, they had the talking, walking sessions, Councillor Selman, which again moved to online during COVID, but they are coming back. So they've come back slowly, but they are all coming back face to face. I just can't sit here and say they're all back, but I know we've been having the conversations about coming back because they need to. So that's what's happened. So dealing with the backlog is an ongoing issue. It's a real issue. It's a live issue in thinking about how do we address that. And so one of the ways, as I've just said, is that I know that they're stopping attending meetings in order to put children first. But they are dealing with short staff. I think the recruitment isn't a recruitment issue just for early years practitioners. It's a recruitment issue for all of children's services, for everybody working in the sector. So teachers, nursery education officers, social workers, and our therapists also, and no different, nurses, health visitors. It's across the entire system. So it is a real concern. Regarding the financial crisis, I can say, and apologise, that there was a delay in confirming the local rates for providers this year. So yes, they were right to raise that, and there was a delay. What happened is that the local authority is funded at one point in the year by the DfE. So it's the census in the spring term, which is in around the February time. And over the last 2 years, because of COVID, what's been happening is that the DfE, to ensure that every provider gets the funding that they're entitled to, they've been adjusting that funding each term. And because they've been, I mean, if you think about it, a local authority, we adjust it at one point in the year, the spring term. That's when we do it. For the last 18 months to 2 years, we've been doing it every term. So what that means is it's taken more accounting time, and therefore you almost have to close one account before you can then move on to the new hourly rate. And that's what's happened, and that's what I've explained to the providers. In terms of the rate, I mean, I think some councillors will have already heard me say that when the DfE funds local authorities a particular rate, and we use that rate where 90% of that has to be around the what we call a base rate, which is lower than the rate that they give us, and then there are supplementary rates that you get on top of that. And the supplementary rates are an additional amount if you live in an area of deprivation, or the children live in an area of deprivation, an additional rate for qualification. So if you have got that early years professional status qualification, an additional rate for children that are eligible for free school meals. So depending who how many children fits those categories, or how many staff you fit that categories, will determine what your rate is. So your rate could be as low as £4.99, which is the base rate, to as much as £7.49, I think it is, if you meet the criteria for all of that, all of the other additional supplementary rate. So it does impact on the hourly rate that the settings, you know, there were some winners and some losers as a result of that. But when we look at colleagues, which is my pet, my bugbear, which I've taken up with the DfE. So Islington have a protected rate, Camden has a protected rate, and what that means is they get more money than we do. And that makes me quite cross, because it's been protected the last few years and it continues to be protected. And it means that just across settings across the border are in a better financial position than our settings are. But we do keep raising this with the DfE. I hope that answers your question. It is impacting on sustainability. So just to give you, if I've got time, Councillor Conway. So one particular
30 seconds, please,
okay.
Donna, because I want to ask 2 more questions very briefly. So 30 seconds, please.
Yeah. So some settings do not accept children, or accept very few children who are eligible for their free entitlement. That's a problem for us, because it means children who are eligible for their free entitlement will not be offered a place at some settings. And then you've got other settings where 75%, 80% of their children are on the free entitlement, and they can't make ends meet on just the free entitlement. So some of them are having to be supported to relook at their business model to have a balance of children, which in terms of supporting the most vulnerable children or disadvantaged children, it is a problem, but it's the only way that they can sustain their business model.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to have 2 more questions, please. Councillor Turbot-Deloff, and then Monique, you have a question, and then we'll move on. Right, so Councillor Turbot-Deloff, please.
Thank you, Chair. My question is around mental health in early years workforce. Firstly, with acknowledgement of what I'm feeling now of the mental health of early years workforce as well, and the support available to them. We're hearing now about 0-hour contracts and heavy workload, and in some instances, wages that are not sufficient for the cost of living at the moment. So I would like to pay that acknowledgement now. My question is, has there been any identifiable aspects or behavior of impact on the emotional and mental health of children where early year provision regularly changes staff due to the challenges we just have heard? And if there isn't, can this be looked into by the Council? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And Monique, please.
I have a 2-part question here. So it has been highlighted that Hackney has recorded a decline in the uptake of free funded 2-year-old childcare of 15 hours, which is directed at children who are most in need. Accepting that this is part of a wider regional and national trend, what more can Hackney Education and the wider council do to effectively target and support this cohort of families to increase uptake, and whether there has been any analysis of the barriers to local uptake around this? Part B, a follow-on question from this I'd like to also ask is, have there been any discussions around the increase in scope regarding the 2-year-old funding childcare, particularly for those who are single parents working full-time, who spend quite a lot on the childcare? So, you know, what would the possibility of extending this funding be, considering there has been a decline in the uptake of the free funded childcare at present?
Thank you. Tim, Donna?
Tim, can I hand the mental health support to you? And I'm going to hand the 2-year-old over to you, but I just want to make a point here that there hasn't been a decline in terms of eligible 2-year-olds not taking up their provision. What there has been a decline in is the numbers of eligible children. So what that means is that every term the DWP write to us to tell us how many eligible children you have. So we've seen a decline in the numbers of eligible children, but children taking up their provision has actually increased, and Tim may say a little bit more about that. And we've increased greater than other local authorities. So I think, yes, it's not that there's a decline because children are not accessing it, it's because there's a decline in the number of eligible children that the DWP have told us about. So I think I'll just leave it there. And the other thing is, Tim, before I come in, is that the rate, I think, is £6.77 an hour that providers get. That rate comes straight from, or is it 6.60? It's £6 something. It's more than the rate for 3 and 4 year olds. And most of that money goes straight through to providers, and we don't set the eligibility for it. So all we're doing is the government sets the eligibility, they set the rate in which we can work within. We have to passport 95% of the money that we get in, so we can't keep it and do other things with it. And therefore we can only use it for its intended purpose, and we passport it. So we don't have a choice about what else we do with it. We just have to use it for the intended purpose based on the census headcount, which takes place every term. So how many children have you got taking up their eligibility? This is the money we will give you. If we've given you too much money because you've got less children taking it up, they will claw it back. So it's not our money to play with. Tim, I'm going to hand over to you for the rest.
I'll be quick. Thanks, Donna. Actually, Donna said most of the things I was going to say. The total number of eligible children has gone down significantly over the past 4 years. It's the Department for Work and Pensions that decides who's eligible. Last week, we got the 2022 census data. So in 2018, there was 2,300 eligible children. This year, there was 1,766. So it's gone down over 500. So the 500 fewer eligible 2-year-old children. And of course, that has a knock-on impact in settings because there's fewer children. If there's fewer children, they're getting less money and they've got more vacancies. In terms of the take-up of eligibility, yes, you're right. The percentage dropped last year, and the absolute number of children dropped last year. It dropped nationally. It dropped in every local authority across the country. The January census was published last week, and the percentage take-up has gone up to 66% in Hackney. So it's increased by 9% from last year. I haven't yet had time to go through and do a comparative of how how it compares with London. I know we're still higher than London. I don't know how we compare with our statistical neighbours, but it's a positive story. However, if 66% of our current 2-year-olds take up their place, it does mean that 34% of them don't. And that's what we've got to work on. And every year we look at different and more innovative ways of getting to those children. Last year, the DWP list included phone numbers, not for all children, but for quite a number of children. So we phoned every family that wasn't taking up their entitlement and had a conversation with every family on our list to find out why they weren't taking up their entitlement and what we could do to encourage them. The DWP list also comes with emails, so we email. They come with addresses, so we send postcards and we send letters. We use the DWP list in our children's centres, and they match with their attendance data. So if parents have ever come to any stay and plays or drop-ins, the children's centre contacts those families as well and say, you may be eligible, come on, let's take up a place. But understandably, if lots of families are accessing all sorts of free stuff that we do in the children's centres, they may not want to take up a place elsewhere, and we can lead the horse to water. But many parents just don't want to put their 2-year-old in a setting, and that's obviously parental choice. The other question was about supporting. It was the mental health question, and yeah, this is we're getting better as a local authority at recognising the issues and supporting the managers in the settings. We have all sorts of small group cluster meetings where we work with settings, where we discuss specific issues and challenges, and we support settings to work them through. We're getting better at it. It's becoming more embedded in our in our practice, but I completely agree with you. It is something that seems to be growing faster than we can sort of manage to support settings. And I'm sure that your conversations with providers, it probably came through. You know, there's a whole string of challenges. They're struggling with the hourly rate that it won't cover costs. They're struggling with staffing. They're struggling with increased spiraling costs, and they're struggling with there being fewer and fewer children in Hackney that actually want an early years place. And they're struggling with the effects of the internal childcare market, where schools are competing with playgroups who are competing against the private sector, who are competing against the voluntary sector. And we're seeing the market playing out. The response from the government is to say, oh, if you're struggling with childcare costs at a ratio of 1 to 4, all we need to do is have a ratio of 1 to 5, and then you don't need to have so many staff, and you can get more income with less expense. Now, obviously, that's fraught with issues around the quality of care that you can then give to those children. The response from providers seems to be very much against it because they know it will have an impact. But it does seem to sort of underline the direction of travel in terms of how national government is supporting crisis in childcare. I think I'll probably leave it there before I end up becoming too political.
Councillor Conway, may I just add to I don't think the question was asked about, well, if there are high staff turnover, will that impact on children? And whilst we can probably, or I can respond to that on an anecdotal basis, or where I might have seen it in the children's centres, you know, it will. You know, if children's caregivers, someone they have a relationship with, is, you know, moves on quite quickly, or they have lots of agency staff interacting with them, the agency staff doesn't really know them, doesn't know their parents, doesn't know the routine or the environment, it will impact on children. And that's why the stability and the recruitment issue becomes very important. They shouldn't, young children shouldn't need to have experience so many caregivers in a short space of time. So yes, I would expect that it would have an impact because it's not stable.
Thank you very much for that. I think it'll be a good idea, I think, for us to sort of summarise what's come through this evening, but also in the focus group that we held last week, and to make some sort of suggestions. In particular, we were hearing from some of the providers last week, especially those, or one in particular, who they have settings in other local authorities, and it was really interesting to hear what some of the other local authorities are doing to try and support with the recruitment issues, which I think would have a knock-on effect with many of the things that we've been talking about in terms of being able to support our very young children in having the sort of continuity of care that we know is so vitally important for the emotional development. So yes, I think, yeah, we'll be sending some recommendations, because I think there are a few other things mentioned about partnerships, although I appreciate that you've mentioned already today with some of our colleges to see if we can help to upskill some of the people who are coming from our sixth form colleges, to ensure that we've got a sort of a work-ready workforce, and also to maybe improve our training offer so that it's meeting more of the specific recruitment needs that our providers are experiencing. So we will write to you with that, those recommendations and suggestions. So thank you very much both to Donna and Tim for your contributions. You're more than welcome to stay, but you certainly don't have to. It's a lovely evening, so you probably won't want to. Okay, we're moving on to item 7, which is the admissions and school places item. Each year, the Commission reviews local admission processes for both reception and secondary school level entry and the wider school place planning role of the Council. This helps the Commission maintain oversight of school places across and ensure that there is sufficient local capacity. Hackney Education has provided a report on school admissions outcomes and school place planning, which is at pages 59 to 70 of the report pack. For this item, we have David Court, who is the head of school organisation and commissioning, and we have Annie Gammon, the Director of Education, who I appreciate is unwell, so we will take it easy with you this evening, Annie. So we have 40 minutes for this item, although less now because we did run over in the previous item. So can I ask officers to be really succinct in highlighting key information from the report for no longer than 5 minutes, please? And then we will go to questions from the Commission. So I'll let Councillor Bramble open, but can we be quick, please? And then over to Annie and or David.
Thank you, Chair. I'll have my camera off because I am also unwell this evening, but will stay for the meeting as long as I can. Just to note that due to the pandemic, the normal arrangements of parents being able and children being able to visit schools haven't been able to work in the same way. But despite this, Hackney choices still remains very high, and lots of parents and children still choosing to send and join Hackney schools. Also, there's a downward trend on the number of school places overall. This is acutely, you may be acutely aware this isn't just a Hackney issue, this is pan-London, but also through the work with the LGA, I'm acutely aware of that in other regions. This is an issue as well, and I know that officers will go into more detail on both of the comments I've just mentioned. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Councillor Bramble. I'll just speak briefly and then hand over to David for more detail. As Councillor Bramble says, that theme, which was also in the early years one about fewer children, is present. And you know, we've presented before at Scrutiny about the estate strategy, which is our approach to making sure we manage the falling roles while providing additional special educational needs places in Hackney, and making sure that there's a good local place for every child. David will talk more about the number of children and families who've got one of the choices of schools that they want. There are a small number who don't get one of their choices. They don't always use all their choices. And where those children live isn't always evenly spread. And we'll talk about that as well in the, there's a table of postcodes there that you can see. I'm going to hand over to David for highlights from the report. David, thanks.
Thanks, Annie. Yeah, just to highlight some key information from the report, we're seeing in terms of the reception applicants this year, we have witnessed a 1.8% decrease on the size of the cohort of children applying for reception in Hackney. And if we look back to 2017, we've seen a decrease of 18% across that period. In London, the changes aren't so significant. A 1.3% decrease in the size of the reception cohort compared with last year, and compared with 2017, a 9.4% decrease. So we're seeing a trend in line with London, and perhaps a greater decrease in the number of reception children in Hackney compared with the wider all of London. In terms of the popularity of our schools, we still have a high percentage of reception applicants expressing a first preference for Hackney schools, 92.5% this year, and that was in the same range as last year, with which had 94% of children expressing a first preference for Hackney schools. In terms of the outcomes for Hackney children, as outlined in the report, we've got 88.6% of children being offered their first choice. And if we look at those being offered first, second or third choice, 97.1%. This on the whole, this is above the London percentages as we were last year. It's slightly above the London-wide average on those measures. In terms of the children offered any of their preferred schools, 98.27% of children are offered one of their preferences, and this is in line with the London average on the same measure. Children offered one of their preferred schools is 98.04, so very similar to the London averages. In terms of the families for whom we weren't able to offer any of their preferred schools, there were 36 families with a reception age child for whom we made an alternative offer. And this is normally an offer at the nearest school to their home, which has a vacancy remaining, after all the on-time applicants have been offered places. That's 1.72% of our Hackney cohort. And for London, it's similar. 1.96% of London families are in a similar situation where we can't offer one of their preferred schools. Very similar number to last year when we had 38 families. This year was 36 families. I think the number of reception vacancies we have does allow us to offer all of these families a place within a very reasonable distance from their home. If we move on to the secondary cohort, I'm going to just offer some similar statistics. So if we look at the trend, down 3.4% on the number of secondary families compared with last year in Hackney, and down 8.2% since 2017. So a less significant drop, but still the trend is seeing a reduction in the numbers of families in Hackney at these points entering education. London saw a 1.1% drop last year, but interestingly, compared with 2017 across the whole of London, London is up 4.6%. I don't have anything to offer in terms of why that is. I do think that the general trend has been to move out of inner London boroughs, and I think that's perhaps outer London boroughs will be seeing a greater be seeing less of a drop, and in some cases an increase in the size of the secondary cohort. Again, in terms of popularity, 86.5% of families in Hackney expressed a first preference for a Hackney secondary school, largely in line with last year, 84.5%.
Sorry, David, can I just say you've got about a minute left, please, because we're running a bit over. I'd just like to get some questions in as soon as possible. Sorry, very sorry.
Absolutely. 66.7% are offered their first choice at secondary school, or 89% one of their top 3 choices. In London, this compares with 69.95%, so we're slightly under the London average getting first preference, and 89.27%, so on a par with the number of children getting one of their top 3 preferences. 93% of children overall were offered one of their preferred schools, and this is in line, comparable to the London average of 94%. This year, 151 families weren't able to be offered any of their preferred schools. That's 6.6%. This is a slightly higher percentage than London, which is essentially 6% in London. Similarly, families not able to offer any of their preferred schools. Last year, we had 183 families in this situation, which represented 7.5% of our secondary transfer cohort. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, David. I'll kick us off with a question, but please do, if you're online, please do raise your virtual hands if you would like to ask a question, and indicate to me if you have one here in the chamber. Okay, I've noted the 2 of you. Thank you very much. The question that I wanted to ask is about the school place planning. And we've obviously seeing a significant fall in the demand for reception places, and we're anticipating that that's going to decrease even further in 2023 and beyond. Are any further reductions in PAN envisaged for 2023-24, other than the ones that have been outlined in the report? Are we noticing any trends with regards to the schools that are most impacted by falling demand for reception places? And how are the schools that reduce their capacity identified? Do they put themselves forward for this, or are they identified? So I think that's my question, and I think what I'm getting at there, David, is who is bearing the brunt of these falling school rolls? Is it mainly, the oversubscribed schools? To my anecdotal knowledge as a resident of Hackney, is that tend to be in the more affluent parts of the borough, and that the schools that struggle a bit more with to fill the schools tend to be the schools in the more socially deprived areas. So who is mostly impacted by the fall in school rolls, and who is identified? How are we identifying the schools to reduce their capacities? Question from Councillor Charlton, please.
Thank you, Chair. So David, my question relates to a matter that I've raised with you before in relation to the admissions criteria of the local authority, commonly followed also by other secondary schools, where I've asked that the authority looks into the reason that the criteria was changed from giving priority to children for whom a school was the closest school, and just, you know, to what it is currently, which is just basically on more distance, disadvantaging children who live in basically secondary school deserts. So within my own ward, most of the children have to pass by 4 schools in order to get to a school with vacancies. Why can they not go to their nearest school? Thank you.
And sorry, David, before I just hand over to you for that question, just something to flesh that point that Councillor Charlton has just made out a bit. Curious, for example, that we can see on table, on table 3, we can see that E5, the total number of children who are not offered a preference on National School Offer Day is 52. To my knowledge, Mossbourne Community Academy is in E5, and yet they admit 24 children out of borough. How does that happen if we've got so many children within, and we're hearing from Councillor Charlton that she has constituents in where she is a councillor who are having to travel to Haggerston School, which is, you know, quite a way away from where she is a councillor, to yeah. So how does that work? Over to
Sorry to interrupt you, but do you mind if I just add to that? It's the children as well in E9, who I believe most of whom live on Kingsmead Estate. I'd be really interested in a ward breakdown, particularly of those E9 children, to know whether they live in, you know, Kings Park ward or Hackney Wick, or even Homerton ward, because, you know, those are the children that I'm most concerned about, if I'm honest.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Shall I take the first question about PANs, and David might add a bit more detail, and then David will pick up the point about the particular areas and particular admissions criteria. And that latter point is one that Councillor Travan's right, she has talked to us about this, and we have explored solutions, and Councillor Bramble has raised that as well. The PANs, so the PANs that are listed are permanent PAN changes that have to be consulted on, and they always have to be consulted on at least 19, 20 months in advance of the time a child would actually start school. Schools sometimes do ask for temporary caps on PANs so they can manage numbers. So for instance, a 2-form entry primary school where they can see that they've got 30 children rather than 60 or rather than 50, will say, can we do a temporary cap here, but we think we're going to get more children coming through next year, so it's only temporary for that 1 year. It's generally, the temporary PANs are often raised by the school themselves. They will say, we need to manage our budgets, we've only got funding for this number of children, so we can't afford to have 2 teachers here, so they will often raise the temporary PANs. And sometimes they will raise, actually, we need to make this permanent now so that they can manage their budgets. In looking at the numbers, we did initiate some discussions with 1 or 2 schools who looked as though they had over a period of time not got close to their PAN numbers. But I would say it's always a discussion. So it's not something imposed on any particular school, but it is done together, working as partners. In terms
Sorry,
of where,
Annie, I'm really sorry to interject,
Mm.
but is there any way that we can be a bit more proactive with that? Because the worry that I have is that it's the same schools that end up being vulnerable, and it's the same schools that will then come to us and say, actually, we've got falling school rolls, we've been struggling because we've been under capacity for a while. They'll be the ones who will apply for a temporary PAN and presumably be the ones who will be most vulnerable to having a permanent PAN. So I'm really just, how can we be a bit more proactive and strategic with this to ensure that we don't end up having, schools, let's face it, in the more affluent parts of the borough that are thriving and not having to, reduce their, although I do appreciate that there are a couple on that list, but just how can we be more proactive to ensure that we're not rendering the schools in the more disadvantaged areas the most vulnerable?
I think there's a balance between some of the legal rights that parents have to choose a school. So I think, for instance, we have considered whether we should ask some of our, popular full schools to reduce sizes. What we might then find is that the parents say, but that's the school I want my child to go to. Why are you reducing the size of it? So I think there are some nuanced arguments around that. We are looking at areas where there is a real oversupply of places. And certainly, if we look at the distribution of schools, there are more in the southwest of the borough, then there's quite a lot of capacity there. I think we also find that when vacancies occur at more schools that are oversubscribed, they get snapped up. And we have seen over the last 4 years, and the admissions team have seen more midterm changes as parents move their children to other schools. I think the estate strategy is very much about managing this process, so there isn't lots of churn in the system, and the schools can manage the process well. Maybe Councillor Bramble wants to come in, and then I'll hand over to David for the local area issue.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you, Chair. Just to say, the particular casework issue is being picked up, and Annie will go back and talk with the school, and obviously won't go into as much detail with an individual case, but more broadly, when I'm talking with Annie, it's about that conversation that we're having with the school, recommending, suggesting. Obviously, some schools that are able to set their admin criteria, obviously they have the choice to choose, but it's how we then influence, suggest, and have that dialogue with schools, which is very much what I'm advocating for, and Annie and her team are doing. But it is definitely something that we're in constant dialogue about, but it's quite frustrating that there is the variation in terms of what schools are saying they want to do around their administration criteria.
Thank you. Over to you, David.
Yes, I think just picking up on what Councillor Brambles indicated, it is a case of in terms of balancing up or rectifying the issue of certain areas where children are less likely to be successful for the nearest schools. So the background to understand about this is that as a local authority, we have the power to change the admissions criteria for the community secondary schools, Stoke Newington and Hackney. All the other schools, we are not the authority that set the admission criteria that would determine who has priority for the places. For the voluntary aided church schools, it's the governing body of the school. And for the academies, it's the academy trust. So the type of influence we can have on these schools and on this issue raised by Councillor Troughton is one of persuasion and looking at the greater good, the bigger picture of admission. The government sets down key criteria which are mandatory for all schools, such as obviously looked after children, and then recommends certain criteria that are acceptable along the lines of, sibling priority. And then most schools would, at the bottom end of their admissions criteria, be prioritising children who live nearest to the school. And this is the case for the closest school to the children on the Kingsmead estate. City Academy has fairly standard criteria in that sense, that after the looked after children and other higher priority categories, children with siblings, they then offer the remaining places to children who live closest. And it's a function of the spacing of the schools. That means that a school like City Academy runs out of spaces before getting far enough down the list to be offering to children in these, for want of a better word, dry spots or black spots. So the approach we need to take is longer term, necessarily because the admission arrangements, if they were to change, would need 18 months lead time before we could bring them in. So it's about initiating discussions now about highlighting to the academies and schools nearby the impact of this phenomenon or this reality, and seeking their support in working together and their agreement to change their admission arrangements. We're not in a position to impose changed arrangements that could resolve this issue immediately. So that's the challenge. It's about working with the schools to for the greater good of Hackney children, particularly in these areas.
Thank you very much, David. Got a question from Joe, and then we have, I don't think we have, forgotten your name now.
Andy.
Sorry?
Andy.
Andy, I'm so sorry, Andy. It's the first meeting of the municipal year. I'll get better. Okay, Joe.
Thank you. My question was partially covered actually by your earlier question, Councillor Conway, but I did also want to ask if Hackney is still committed, as they have been in the past, to keeping all schools open. Other neighbouring boroughs with falling roles, particularly at primary level, have been consulting and ending up with schools that have been closing and or merging with other schools. Do we still have that commitment to keep all our individual local schools open? And I also wanted to ask, how does the falling role impact on the school estate strategy in relation to the increasing numbers of children with special educational needs and the provision of school places and indeed a new special educational needs school, which is also being talked about, and how that will relate to falling roles and the estates? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've just got a two-part question. I think one relates to what you just asked there, and this is around financial sustainability for schools that are experiencing falling roles at the moment. What support is being put in place by Hackney Education or the Council to safeguard these schools that are at risk at the moment financially due to no fault of their own? And the other question I'd like to ask is, I know, David, you mentioned that the admissions authorities are responsible for setting the criteria for entry for admissions. But one of the questions I'd like to ask is regarding some of the more popular schools within the local authority in the more affluent areas. To what extent any of those schools are offered or have offered and have accepted numbers of students above PAN, which then creates additional stress on the other schools?
Okay, shall I answer the first question? One of the things we are absolutely committed to is the quality of education for every child. And as Andy and Joe have alluded to, that can sometimes become difficult where a school has real budgetary problems. Although I should say that probably our smallest school in the borough has just had a good Ofsted. So I think that it's very feasible to run schools really well with numbers significantly below really what the size of the building was that they're set in. We want to make sure that every child has a really good local place, and I think the school estate strategy sets out that commitment to make sure that happens. We do need to look at some options, and those options have included using the space to create additional resource provision. And indeed, we have 2 sites that are empty at the moment, not used for educational purposes, in the old Nightingale site in Harrington Hill, in providing some additional special needs places. So I think we are looking at those closely. The long-term trends of population indicate an upward rise, and I think we're very keen not to make any decisions that close off future growth. I think the other point was about what support we give to schools, and I think one of the things we can't do, much as we would like to, is to suddenly create more children. So the numbers are the numbers, and some schools will have fewer children than they have capacity for. We have at Schools Forum agreed some support for schools that do have to reduce their staffing. So that support is there. And as a borough, we're really keen to promote all our schools. We know that schools have their individual promotion, but actually as a whole, we set out documents about the benefits of education in Hackney. We are very keen to support our schools.
Thanks, Annie. Picking up the question about schools offering above PAN. This is not common practice in my experience of other authorities, but in Hackney, since I joined 5 years ago in the admissions team, our secondary schools, a number of our secondary schools do over offer between the 1st of March and census, the census that counts for their funding in October, the October census. This is usually done in the degree of, 6 to 12 additional offers. Schools justify offering over number, for example, if they're challenged at the appeal, by saying that the trend over years shows that the numbers drop back by the time that children start. It does have an impact on the secondary schools that are struggling to fill, and I would say this year the impact is greater as we see a decrease in the size of the secondary cohort. But equally, in previous years, we've relied on those additional offers in order to place all the Hackney residents as we're statutorily required to. So there are advantages and disadvantages to that, and as the size of the secondary cohort, if that trend continues, it's the sort of practice that we would need to reconsider. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
I just wasn't sure if your question about schools merging was answered. Was that touched upon, Joe?
I don't think it was explicitly ruled out. I think there was a commitment was reiterated not to close local schools, as I understood it, that there is a real commitment to keep all local schools available for all, so we're not going to have a scenario where a local school is going to close and then you've got children in a particular area of the borough having to travel further to get to a school. I think, as I understood it, there was equipment not to close schools, but I'm not sure about the merging.
Did you want to come in on that, either of you, about merging schools, smaller schools?
I think in the school's strategy, we are looking at a range of options. So merging, we haven't merged schools. Actually, I think we have merged schools in Hackney. I think the last two were two special schools that merged to form the garden. Merging, so that's a long time ago. So that it can happen. And we do have to keep options on the table as we look at making sure that our schools are sustainable.
Thank you very much. Councillor Woodley, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was only going to comment on the question of the send ARP places. I'm going to guess sort of good news, bad news, really. The good news is that having had kind of quite relatively small tranches of DfE capital funding allocations, sort of both around circa 3 million over the last 4-year period, we've received a commitment to around 13 million, so 6.5 million over the next 2 financial years, which will take us halfway to sort of meeting that sort of commitment to 300 additional places. So there is money to match the kind of ambition that we have and to get that work underway, which is really, really good news. And I wouldn't want that to be lost in this meeting. On the other hand, I think the idea that we can neatly meet any kind of challenges that schools are meeting with putting send places in those schools is too simplistic. We will have to look at the kind of specific layouts of those schools and see if they're suitable for our children with special educational needs, and particularly when they have disabilities as well. So I think, as Annie said, we'll also be looking at 2 sites where we could develop a substantive provision, and we'll be looking at those schools with suitable additional resource provision as well, but it won't necessarily be where the schools are meeting kind of the most challenges at the moment. So I just think you have to be kind of aware of the real politic of the situation.
Thank you very much. Do we have?
Could I just, to follow up on that from Councillor Woodley, do we have a time frame on those plans?
School estate strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have a timeline?
Sorry, I think Annie might be able to come in with more specific dates if she's got
Yes,
information in front of her, but obviously we took phase 1A forward with the first tranche. We have phase 1B coming forward in the autumn. The sort of commitment to 300 places is over this political term, so it's over this 4 years. But Annie, you might want to talk about the additional sites.
Thanks, Councillor Woodley. And we did have that cabinet paper earlier this year that set out, as Councillor Woodley said, that first phase. And there's an ongoing members working group who we are consulting with during this period. And we expect, and I'm sorry, I haven't got the date at my fingertips, we are expecting to bring a cabinet paper forward either at the end of this year or in very first part of next year.
Thank you very much for that. Do we have any further questions from the Commission? Councillor Gordon, I don't know if you wanted to ask the question about our support for refugees. Children.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Chair, if there's time. I mean, obviously Hackney is hosting a number of Ukrainian refugees of school age through the various schemes. I was just wondering really about what sort of efforts have been made to secure timely and suitable education for these children who are obviously moving to our borough from situations of trauma. And I will say what's sort of informing the background of this question is that I have heard of reasonably significant delays in relation to individual children in giving them an opportunity to pick up their education in suitable, late secondary school settings. So it'd be really good to have a sort of update about what's been put in place.
Thanks. David, do you want to answer that? I'm aware of one child where there was a delay, which had some complex reasons behind it. But David, do you want to pick up on the overall provision?
Yes, I think thankfully we do have sufficient places in the bar to be offering all new arrivals from as refugees a suitable school place. the government's been very clear about how admissions are to operate in these circumstances, and they're clear that we must operate school admissions within the existing school admissions code. We can't do things like prioritize Ukrainian refugee children over and above others who might be waiting on school places. We must still operate within the school admissions code. In that sense, we are asking all families arriving to make an application through the regular process, so we're fully aware of their circumstances, and I'm not aware of any significant cases where there's been an undue delay, unless there were complicated circumstances, as Annie's aware. I've been reporting to the government on and involved with tracking the refugee arrivals, and we are able to offer all families a place. Of course, it may not be a place at the school that is right outside the host's home, for example. If it's a popular oversubscribed school, we have to operate the admission arrangements in the same way. But we are offering places within government guidelines and at suitable schools.
Sorry, Councillor Gordon, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether there's how that works really for children who are in sort of, the final years of secondary school, in sort of exam years, because obviously there are, parts of the year where children will be finishing GCSEs, whereas Ukrainian children will be coming here and, looking to sort of take up their education. I mean, I have heard in those sort of circumstances there is probably, delays which those children have found particularly difficult in getting back onto, sort of accessing a full curriculum. I don't know whether there's anything more that can be done that could be a bit more flexible around the needs of these children, rather than just the needs of our sort of exam systems.
I think those families that are arriving with children who would be, for example, in year 11, we need to think practically about what is appropriate for them. If we were to place them in a secondary school, for example, after Christmas, there's the children are very quickly moving on to mock exams, and there's no presence in the secondary schools. When children apply at that stage, we make an assessment of what is most appropriate for them, and channel them into appropriate settings. So, in that sense, we are sort of being flexible. I'm aware of a particular case where the family were seeking a regular school place, for example, but we're looking at what is most appropriate and what is practical in these circumstances.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. If nobody else has any questions, I just have a final 2 questions, and then I think we'll move on to the next item. So I have a question about the admissions arrangements for children with EHCP, EHC plans for reception. I note that on page 66 of the report, it says that 32 children were under assessment as of the 15th of the 2nd, 22. Will EHCP assessments be completed for all these children in readiness for September 2022 entry? And does this appear to be a significant number? Is there a substantial backlog in the service, or are we encountering a sort of increase? That's my first question. And the second question is around planning for school places for children in the Orthodox Jewish community, as it remains a significant concern, which has been set out in the Stamford Hill Area Action Plan. Can officers update the Commission on work taking place to work with the Orthodox Jewish community to help develop in-borough provision, recognising that many will prefer to attend schools in the independent sector?
Thank you. David, do you want to take the EHCP one, and I'll pick up the Orthodox Jewish area?
Yes, thanks, Annie. Yeah, in regard to children with EHCPs at reception, we find that needs are often only just being identified at that age of 4 or 3, 3.5, 4, 5, when the children are applying. So there is usually a number of children that have plans finalised sort of around or after the time we've made off for places in reception. I think this is just a function of mechanism by which the children are identified, time it takes for schools to put them forward. It's not uncommon to have a number of children that are based who their plan finalised after the standard tranche of reception was made. I can't speak to a backlog in the service, but I think it's just a function of the age of the children and the point at which the needs are being identified and assessed. They don't always have a plan in place by the time they're entering reception.
Thanks, David. And in terms of the Orthodox Jewish community, so around, I would say 70 to 75% of the Orthodox Jewish children aged 5 to 16 are in independent schools, registered independent schools. We know that, and those are Ofsted inspected, and we know that while some of them are good, some of them are requires improvement or inadequate. And we are increasing the amount of work we do with those schools and a training offer, a professional development offer for their teachers who are often not qualified teachers, to try and really make sure that offer, where the majority of those children are, is improved. So we've written to those schools with an offer of support that doesn't need to be traded, but there's some element of support in the first instance anyway, for exploratory discussion. And the two maintained schools, or Lubavitch and Lubavitch Boys and Yesodei HaTorah, have made progress from being inadequate to requires improvement. It is difficult for some of those schools to get above requires improvement in terms of Ofsted criteria with the narrow curriculum that is a feature of the schools. I think the area where I think we are likely to see some change over the coming years is for the children who attend unregistered educational settings or yeshivas, as a number of the strands of the government white paper, the education bill, focus on making sure that those settings that they attend become registered and therefore open to inspection. Indeed, we've got a meeting with the Orthodox Jewish community tomorrow morning, and we are taking forward a series of meetings with them to explore what that might mean. You may also know that some of the Orthodox Jewish community are opposed to some of that legislation, but we want to explore what we can do together.
Thank you very much for that, Annie and David. I think we're probably going to bring that item to a close now. I'm just thinking some of the key themes that have sort of emerged from that. I think it'll be good to see what comes from efforts to sort of match the aspirations of the school estate strategy with some of the challenges that we're experiencing in relation to school places, and to have a clearer sense going forward of how we're going to plan for that, because I imagine it's a really tricky scenario to be in, given that we anticipate that school roles will increase again in a few years. So we are, I'm sure, really concerned about losing capacity within our schools only to have to find it again later on down the line. But yes, it would be encouraging if we can see what more can be done around, I think a key theme that sort of emerged for me is about the extent to which the different schools in the borough, situated in different places, for whatever reason, because as Councillor Charlton mentioned, there are black spots. There's a black spot near to me in E9 where children just aren't in any catchment areas for any schools at all. But how we can ensure that some schools aren't vulnerable to this burden of the financial pressures that, you know, they experience when they have falling school rolls, and that these aren't the schools that are most likely to experience, you know, having to consider reducing their school rolls. In all fairness, what I'd quite like to see for primary schools is I recognise that we can't do this for secondary schools. I would like to see random allocation. That's what I would personally like to see, so that it's more evenly distributed, and so that we don't see, you know, a good school here that is at capacity and oversubscribed, and a school next door to it that's outstanding and is undersubscribed quite considerably, which is what we see in Hackney all too much, if you ask me. We've got really good primary schools, and we shouldn't see schools being, you know, as undersubscribed as some as some of them are. And also there are implications, because the schools that parents pick tend to be less diverse. They seem to reflect the parents who are more inclined to, you know, have the means to move into certain areas to be able to get their children into certain schools. So for me, there is a greater need for us to ensure that that this is managed in a way that you know, doesn't undermine our aspirations as a borough to be diverse and inclusive on every level. So thank you very much to you both for that. We will now move on to item 8, which is the outcome from school exclusions report. This is the Cabinet response. So the Commission completed its in-depth review of school exclusions in December 2021. The executive response to the Commission's recommendations were considered and agreed by Cabinet at its meeting on March the 14th, 2022. The Cabinet contained at pages 73 to 101 of the agenda report pack. It should be noted that Hackney Education agreed in full to 17 of the 18 recommendations. There's only one, which is recommendation 10, where there is a general, it says that Hackney Education agrees with this recommendation in general, although the second part needs exploring further. So in particular, that was in reference to providing business support to small and independent alternative provision settings. Do members of the Commission have any comments on the Cabinet response? Sorry, I'll hand over to you, Councillor Bramble.
Hello, Chair. I'm trying to stay with you, and I hope I am coherent throughout the meeting. Just to say that I just want to again welcome the work from Scrutiny on this piece of work, and you know through our in-depth conversations, and welcome back everyone, how important this piece of work is to me. As you know, most of the recommendations, if not all but the one that's going to be discussed, I'm sure Annie will pick that up, were welcomed, and a lot of it was as set out. We are doing, we will continue to, we will begin to develop. And the reason why a lot of that work has been underway is not just because of the length of time of the report or the pandemic. It's because, as you know, it's something that is a priority for myself and colleagues across the council to ensure that we address exclusions, but not just exclusions. It's about the disproportionate effects of exclusion on Black and global majority children, as there's no scientific evidence to suggest that children that are Black or from a global majority should be excluded more than others, and feeds in the wider piece of work that we are doing. I think the piece of work is really helpful and has to continue to be talked about. And although exclusions have reduced, it still hasn't reduced enough. So I welcome the work that secondary schools are doing, but we need to be at least in line with the national average, but below. I will have to commend the work of the primary school sector, Chair, where since 2018, and Annie, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, they have not permanently excluded any child now for several years. And I think there's a lesson to be learned there in terms of what's happening in our primary schools and how we better strengthen the work in transition and think about that journey throughout a child's life in secondary school. But there are lots of things that we are offering to school that are free to help support schools when children are at risk of exclusions. And Annie might want to pick up about independent schools. I don't think we have any issues with working at independent schools, but as you know, independent schools can charge fees. They can sometimes accumulate vast amount of money, and it's how officers are working with government funding, local council funding, around supporting any school or institute, but we are definitely happy to work with any school. And we have, last thing I will say, and Annie may pick up on this as well, we have a vast trade-in services that we offer to all schools, whether they are maintained, voluntary, or independent. I'll pause there, Chair. Back to you, or Annie. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm just on that point, because it might be helpful if we sort of, you know, get through that point on recommendation 10. And thank you very much for, you know, sharing, Councillor Bramble, about, you know, the alternative provision that we're talking about. They are independent settings, and that, you know, for us to offer independent settings the same support that we offer our maintained schools, on the surface doesn't seem to make sense. But I think, however, in the context, it's a bit different, in that, you know, if we had a pupil referral unit that was able to accommodate the needs of all of the excluded pupils, you know, we wouldn't be having to, you know, pay for, or if our exclusion rates weren't as high as they are, we wouldn't be having to pay as much as we're having to for, you know, for independent settings anyway. And I think the key challenge for us, for those of us who went and visited these alternative provisions, the independent settings, many of them fell significantly short of what we are used to encountering when we visit maintained schools within the borough, in terms of size, in terms of layout, in terms of decor, in terms of resources. And I think where we're getting at with this is that how can we as a local authority ensure that wherever it is that we commit to and that we're funding placements for, how can we ensure that all of our children are receiving the standard of education that they should be receiving? And in particular, recognising that these are the children who have often the most acute needs. So I think for me, the balance would be that it says here in the response that the Directorate of Alternative Provision is regularly monitored, reviewed to ensure that the capacity and assess and to assess whether the offer matches the needs. And I think that that's the balance for me. I think that we need to be ensuring that we are able to meet the needs, and if we aren't able to meet the needs with the alternative provision that's on offer, then we need to be thinking about whether we can increase the support that is offered to the alternative provision, the existing alternative provision that might, for example, be, you know, have the premises might be too small, or they might just need additional business support to increase their capacity or reach or focus or what have you. So I do hope that we'll be able to explore that one a bit more, recognising the nuances there. I'm going to let Councillor Selman and then Councillor Binny Lubbock come in, and then Councillor Woodley, is that okay if you come in afterwards? Great. Councillor Selman.
Sorry if this isn't the right place to be raising this, or the right stage to be raising this. It was just, we can pick up at the end maybe, but it was whether we'd given sort of any further thought to how we both communicate the the report findings, and also now the executive response to it, to a wider audience in a more accessible way, including feeding back to the people who contributed to the review. Like I say, I have to pick it up at the end, but just whether we'd given it further thought about how we could turn it into something a bit more accessible and sort of widely shared.
Thank you for that, Caroline Selman. That has been an intention of ours, so we will sit down and have a think about when we might realistically be able to do that. We did want to have like a abridged version of it that would be more accessible for us to be able to distribute, so we will get onto that one. Councillor Binny Lubbock.
Hi there. Yeah, so obviously I'm new to the commission, so I wasn't involved in the writing of the report, but yeah, it's really excellent work. And just a couple of comments on this and on the response to it. With recommendation 1, it's got a few different elements of monitoring data, but it doesn't have send status on there specified. So I'm wondering if that is one of the monitoring data that should be in there. One of the things that was raised to me by an educator was we've got quite a few rights responsive schools, which is UNICEF program, especially in the primary sector. in our primary schools, and I'm wondering if that's something that we should be pushing, because that could help create more inclusive schools. That means that the young people are more aware of their rights and more aware of, or more able to be included in how the schools approach setting behaviour standards. And I'm also just wondering if there were some recommendations by the Youth Parliament that might have been not responded to, that maybe we should do. I might have missed that.
Thank you for that. I think in answer to the last question, I think that there's quite a lot of pieces of work that I'm hoping that we might, in the next item, choose to explore further. I think that this report alludes quite considerably to issues around the behaviour policy, which is behaviour policies of our schools, which has also been touched upon, I think, in the broader conversations that we've had surrounding Child Q. So I think that it's a starting point, this piece of work, really, for us to be able to think a bit more about the outcomes for children from Black and global majority backgrounds and children with special educational needs. We'll come back to you on the first question that you'd asked about the data, the monitoring data, and we'll clarify that for you, Councillor Binny Lubbock. Councillor Gordon. Sorry, you're on mute.
It's not really a question, it's more a comment. I think, yeah, I welcome the executive response to this. Obviously, this is, was an extremely significant piece of work by the Commission. There was a really large number of people involved in this, who gave their time to the report, including young people who shared their experiences of being excluded from school, and their parents, and what a sort of cliff edge that was from being excluded from the school community. So, and I think we are all aware, really, of the vulnerable position that children excluded from school are put in, and it's really, really good to hear the executive's commitment, I think, to sort of working on our recommendations to improve their experience. And I also think, really, that this report, which is obviously going to come back to the Commission, really is picking up on Councillor Binny Lovett's point, is very much a sort of living document. I think, during the course of this inquiry, I would say, really, I think that the executive, both, political and officer level, have sort of responded to our own ongoing inquiry, and there's been a sort of, I think, policy development during the course of this inquiry, as well as in response to our recommendations. So I hope it's going to be a sort of living document, really, which I think informs policy going forward. And I really welcome Councillor Selman's reminder, really, about the importance of having an accessible version, really, to all those many people who contributed to it. But also, I think, would be benefit from reading about these recommendations and sort of working with us on an ongoing basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gordon. Councillor Woodley.
I was just picking up on your remarks around alternative provision, Chair. We're in quite an interesting moment, I think, with the Sen Green paper and their sort of its push towards greater school accountability, focus on respite, returning children to school where that is the right decision for them. And it'll be interesting to see how we apply that as we create an action plan to sit under the SEND strategy. New members may not have seen that SEND strategy, but there'll be an opportunity, I think, for the Commission to review that and the action plan that will sit beneath that, and that will take sort of learnings, I suppose, from some of the consultation outcomes around the Sen Green paper. There are questions in my mind around the benefits of respite. Sometimes disruption and change to routine is really difficult for children that are subject to dysregulation. Is it beneficial to the child, or is it beneficial to the school, is always the kind of underlying question. But I just wanted to, I suppose, tip my hat to you in terms of the remarks that you made around alternative provision. I recognise the value of what you have to say, and definitely not taking my eye off that ball, along with officers not only on this call but in the SEND team.
Thank you. And Annie?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about AP, and there are a number of really thorough recommendations in the document about AP, and as we've responded, we're taking them forward, and I know that contact, interaction, monitoring, evaluation, and support for AP will be greatly strengthened in the next academic years. We've got a key officer working on that. It does overlap with SEND, and I absolutely think that data must have the SEND status in it. As Councillor Woodley's alluded to in the Green Paper, special schools and alternative providers are almost talked about in the same breath as the same kind of organisation. So I think that's giving AP much more status, which is helpful. And we know that that's an issue not just in Hackney or across London, but a national issue. So I do think we will know, understand, and to bring into the fold our alternative providers much more, partly through the response to the report, and partly through work through the Green Paper. I also think the rights responsive behaviour policies, I know Councillor Conway and Councillor Gordon and I have talked a bit about items possibly for the work programme, and some of the links to behaviour come up in that, including rights for the children. I'm pleased to say that we've appointed somebody to be an Inclusion and Diversity Systems lead, working with schools to take forward an Inclusion and Diversity Charter, and that will undoubtedly look at basing some of that on human rights.
Thank you very much. That's really encouraging to hear, because we spoke quite a bit about, championing our commitments to inclusion and working towards ensuring that we feel that our schools in our exclusion stats and data, reflect the commitment that many of us all hold so dear. Very briefly, Councillor Bramble, we're running over, so if you could be very brief and then we'll just move on to the next item, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just to mention, to build on what Annie was saying about the Inclusion Charter, that's very much based on the principles of the manifestos. And when I spoke about exclusion and the broader work, that's what I was more alluding to, because you can't just talk about the negative impact within the system and not take a more holistic, broader approach. And that starts with inclusion, and what does that mean around inclusion? And then you deal with all the disproportionate outcomes for Black and global majority children, including those outcomes for SEND. So it's very much under the umbrella of inclusion and pulling everything into that framework. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. We're now going to move on to the next item, which is the work programme. Oh, I'm sorry, I've missed something. And that was that we were going to agree when we want the exclusions report to come back for an update. Typically, this would be between 6 to 9 months from when it was agreed at Cabinet, which in this case was March. So I was thinking around December, January, we can try and work it into the work programme if you're all in agreement. Great, thank you very much. Now moving on to item 9, the last substantive item of the meeting. Martin, did you want me to hand over to you now, or shall I open it up? I'll open it up. So this is the item on the work programme for 2022-23. So the Commission develops a new work programme each year to ensure that it remains current and relevant to the needs and priorities of the community and other stakeholders. It builds a new work programme through 3 methods. Standing items, so those are items which are of critical importance and which the Commission has a role to monitor and oversee. And these are detailed in Appendix A, and examples of those are the 2 items that we looked at today, for example. We also then have public and stakeholder consultation, which is a wide-ranging consultation to generate suggestions for consideration within the work programme, and these are detailed in Appendix B. We then have horizon scanning, which is emerging issues of national and local importance, which may further inform the work programme. We're not going to be able to agree the work programme in full today. The purpose of today's item on the work programme is threefold: for us to publish all suggestions to ensure transparency and openness, to allow members to review and discuss suggested items and topics, and to allow members to begin to agree on and prioritise those items or issues which should be included in the work programme. In terms of our capacity, that's our biggest challenge. We have quite a few standing items. There's quite a lot of work that we carry over from the previous year, things that we've requested, for example, like the exclusions review to come back. And then we tend to like to try and leave a bit of space for any topical things that come up, which tend to always be the case. So the circulated outline meeting plan for the year, which you can see now. Did you want to run through this, Martin?
This just to demonstrate this is just with the standing items on your work program, so you get an idea of what the capacity is for, in terms of your discussions and your prioritization about the number of items and the capacity which the Commission can take. Obviously, we can take other items outside the meeting in terms of we might have to do the capacity to do an in-depth review or a scrutiny in a day. So the real issue is just to kind of prioritise the topics that you want to take forward and to think it's worthwhile to look at in terms of where we can have benefit, what resonates with the community and aligns with the Council's corporate priorities. And so they've got the priority, so you can prioritise those, and then we can have the good discussions about how best they're taken. It could be that we come to this meeting, could be taken in a more review format outside, or it could be more information gathering. So today really is just about transparency, putting the suggestions on the table for members to have that discussion in public about items that they want to kind of prioritise for the Commission to look at, whether for the benefit for us to look at. And the other piece of work is how we can shape that into the work programme afterwards, really. So today really is about transparency and openness, making sure for all our public kind of suggestions and our suggestions of other stakeholders that these are given due recognition and members have a chance to oversight and make those kind of comparisons across those different things from Appendix A, Appendix B and Appendix C, and just forming those, triangulating those into some ideas of priorities.
To say, so from today, it's likely that there are going to be things that none of us are going to suggest are priorities, but might have been suggested by people who aren't present here today. And I think we always try as hard as we can to incorporate any of the suggestions into the work that we're already doing, and to see if we can at the very least, ask questions around some of the things that have been suggested. Some of the suggestions, as you'll note, relate to issues that would more neatly be covered by other scrutiny commissions, so not specifically this one, or might be a good opportunity for us to explore doing a joint piece of work around. So yes, I mean, how should we do it? I don't know whether people want to just share what they feel based on the appendices, what they feel are priorities and that they would really like to see covered. I don't know whether it might be helpful actually for us to go through what we feel our top 3 might be. Would that be helpful? You don't have to come up with 3, but yes, so if you want to just raise your hands, and I'll do it that way, so I won't put people on the spot. And I will start with, I appreciate that you may have a comment, but Councillor Binny Lubbock, if you could comment and then let us know perhaps what your top 3 priorities would be for this municipal year.
Yeah, I haven't actually really got top 3 priorities. My question was more around, can these be mapped out by topic? So if we have a few different ones which are around SEND or ones around mental health, it's obviously broken down like this, it's not very intuitive as to like how many people are interested in different things. And the other point I wanted to make was, in terms of prioritizing this, it would be really great if we could also bring some youth voices into that process. So I know that the Hackney Youth Parliament suggestions all look really good, but I'm not sure we'll necessarily be able to get through all of those. And I'm wondering if they've indicated any kind of prioritization, or if we can go back to them and say, if we have time for 1 or 2 or 3 of these, you know, what order would you like us to take those in?
Thank you for that. That's really helpful. Shall I go to Councillor Gordon? Did you want to come in on that? Sorry, but on your point about sort of having a more intuitive approach, I think that we're going to be having a look at what we're already looking at, and yes, essentially we want to try and group things together, although there is a risk sometimes that we become a bit too broad, so we need to be careful and ensure that we're really certain about what our focus is for each of the items that we decide to take forward, and what perhaps we can do for the next meeting, following on from the conversations that we have, the discussions that we have today. We can perhaps propose how we envisage pulling some of those things together, what we will do with the suggestions that are perhaps not outlined as priorities. Another thing that I'd like us to sort of agree today is that each year we usually do a review. So we've still got the review for last municipal year. We're due to do towards the end of this year, which is on adolescents entering care. We've already begun that piece of work. So again, we will have to choose today, well, not necessarily, but it'd be good if we could sort of choose today what we felt was worthy of a review. So what that means, it wouldn't necessarily be as extensive as the exclusions review, but it's something that we were able to put a bit more resource and energy behind, and perhaps have a few focus groups or meetings with stakeholders and you know, concerned parties. My suggestion for that, if it's worth me putting it forward, I'm going to suggest 2 potentially. One being something that the Youth Parliament did mention, and that's the behaviour policy. If anything, that felt like it was school behaviour policies. If anything, that felt like the thing that was coming up. There was like a variation of the same suggestion. It seemed to all be behaviour policies. And actually, a young person made a really fascinating comment about behaviour policies, not talking, she wasn't commenting on the negative impact in terms of children transgressing the behaviour policies and ending up being excluded. She was talking more about how the behaviour policies are taking away children's autonomy, and whether children can then cope with the outside world when they're so used to having such a prescriptive approach to behaviour management, which so we think that the Youth Parliament would have fantastic contributions to make in terms of guiding whatever piece of work it is that we choose to do around school behaviour policies. But it feels to me to be a topical area, in particular in relation to child Q. So that's my that's my contribution. And also another thing for me would be children's social care. But the piece of work I'd like to see us do would be more exploratory. I'd like us to have a look at who do our children's services working with, who is referred to services, who ends up having sustained support, how long for, when do their cases close, whose cases progress, who ends up at court, who ends up having their children moved, who are they? Who are these people? And I'm asking this because from my own work, I have a sense of who they are, and it can be a bit of a revolving door, much like the criminal justice system. And in which case we need to think about our responsibilities as a corporate parent and our early help offer around that. And I not that I suspect, I know that we see the same disproportionality that we sadly see in exclusions, perhaps not to the same extent in children's social care. So I'd quite like to just do a deep dive to have a look at who is in children's social care, and maybe that might inform another piece of work that we may want to do further along down the line to around how we might grapple with any of the disproportionalities that we may find from that piece of work. So that's my 2 pence, but I broadly support many of the suggestions that you've all put forward. Councillor Gordon.
Yeah, very briefly, Chair. I was just really going to, I think, speak in support of the suggestions that you've made. I mean, I think these are themes that have emerged, you know, across a lot of the work we've done as a commission. I think particularly in relation to behaviour management, I think this has been a suggestion, I think, put forward from all corners of our, our stakeholders group and the public consultation. I think there's increasing, public interest really about, and concern really about the, how our children's behaviour is managed in schools and the impact on that. I think Child Q has really put a sort of spotlight on this, but I think there is public concern really about the sort of accountability in relation to these policies, how they impact disproportionately on different groups of children, and and also I think Scrutiny is absolutely the place to explore that, to take evidence really, I think, from from research and from maybe from outside the borough as well, and really have a very thorough lens put over these policies, and and I would hope really come forward with some suggestions that can improve things going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Suso Runga.
Thank you. In respect of the adolescents entering care review, I would like to maybe suggest that we do a co-designed leaving care plan and look at a care charter as well, and also in terms of fostering, when it comes up in respect of the Commission, that we look at kinship fostering, and particularly when kinship fostering breaks down, and the requirement of the need for council services when kinship fostering breaks down. So I'm trying to sort of create a synergy between those areas.
Thank you. And interestingly, actually, that sort of came to some extent from a meeting that we had last week, actually talking about the work that we're doing around supporting care leavers and accommodation. It was recognised that we need to strengthen the sort of supported lodgings and staying put offer, which is often provided by foster carers. So that feels, it feels as though your suggestions could definitely fit within existing pieces of work that we are that we've already sort of begun. So thank you very much for that one. Councillor Sizer.
I agree with loads of what's been said already today. I think that the behaviour management thing, when coupled with trauma-informed schooling, is really, really key and really important. I would put a plea in that if we're discussing fostering and care and things like that, that we do include adoption, because it is so often sort of overlooked within many areas of policy and discussion. So I'd just put a plea in for that. And I think one way to maybe tie up some of these strands is with the sort of umbrella focus of mental health provision. So if you have mental health as the umbrella topic, then there's many different strands that can slot into that and give a sort of overarching narrative to it. Certainly in terms of behaviour, in terms of trauma, in terms of specific grouping. I think mental health, as we hopefully emerge from the pandemic in some ways, I think is going to be absolutely vital for young people. So that would be my thought.
Thank you very much. Jo?
I also really support us looking into behaviour policies and management in school, and very much also with a well-being and mental health focus, which I think is both connected to and separate from. I think we know we've got huge waiting lists, unavailability of mental health support from CAMS and other places. Schools are reporting astronomical levels of self-harm, eating disorders, huge distress being exhibited. And I think we're only just starting to see a lot of the impact of the pandemic on our young people. And I think we need to be really looking at that. And as has been said before, hearing from young people themselves, having really co-producing this piece of work. I think there's also a piece of work around the emotionally based school avoidance, which links again back into the issue of mental health and possibly with behaviour policies. There's a lot of sort of intersection there. I would also like to put in a plea for continuing to look at our SEND provision. It's another huge issue for us as a borough, as it is nationwide. We've got hugely increasing numbers of children with special educational needs. There's also an intersection there with mental health and well-being, and to really examine how we are planning to meet that need. I know there are various strategies in place, and there's some really big changes on the horizon in terms of the SEND Green Paper. So I think it would be a really important area for us to be examining as a commission.
Thank you, Jo. Did anybody else want to come in? Councillor?
Hello, thank you. I also want to support the behavior policy, but I just wanted to add something else on this. And it's the understanding of the meaning of the school policies, because it can be quite vague and children get in trouble for not understanding them. And I really want to also see that there is a bit of a closer look at cultural differences in how young people, for example, there might be different countries that they respond differently because of the cultural, customs, and they get into trouble just because perhaps a bit louder, because that's just a home, like, for example, my Latin American style, my children might respond. I have got into trouble for that. And I also feel that if we do this would be sort of like the seed as to many of the exclusions that young people get into, and the mental health, and that's the second element to it. I think schools are, and that's one of the suggestions I put forward, and I see that a lot of people as well have. There is a theme about mental health, and I think the levels of stress that young people experience at schools, it's just not okay. To see a young person have a panic attack because they can't find the right pen that is absolutely compulsory school to take, and seeing a child having a panic attack over a pen is just unacceptable. So for me, there is an issue that schools are too strict, and then what is that trust that they have with the schools, and what's the development that they have after they leave school if they are so fearful of every move, of saying anything. And it takes, I think, the autonomy, self-agency, and it's just long-term impact. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for that. Anybody else want to come in? If not, I'm going to propose, there's three key themes really. So if we're talking about umbrella terms, that we can then have a look at all of the other suggestions and see how and where they might fit. So we've got special educational needs quite broadly, mental health quite broadly, and behaviour policies. And then obviously there was also mention of children's social care and fostering and adoption, and just looking at who we have. We did a piece of work in relation, similar to that, in relation to special educational needs, to get a sense of who in the borough has special educational needs. What does that look like? What are the trends? And I think it's always really helpful for us to get a sense of who we're talking about here, because we just hear about acronyms like SEND, and we're not breaking it down into these are children and families with needs, and we need to have a sense of what that looks like. So perhaps what we could even do actually is, between now and the next meeting, maybe we could arrange a time where we can sort of put together some suggestions to sort of group things together, and that you can join, and we can sort of play around with things and bring it back to the commission to see if you're in agreement about the way in which we approach taking these, and the decisions that we make about which one is a review, which one might be something, a really substantive item that would take up an hour and a half. What would be something that we think could be covered in 40 minutes? What do you think we might be able to add value to by going off-site and speaking to people on the ground? So yes, does that sound like a plan, Martin?
I mean, to say it's an iterative process over the next, until the next meeting, for us to work up and scope out where we can add value to these items, and obviously to talk with officers as well in terms of where we feel can have most benefit with them in terms of their priorities and that as well. So it's trying to make that alignment really as well. So
that's a useful point actually, because I've been on this commission since 2015. I started out like you, Monique. I was a parent governor representative, and then became a councillor, and then became the chair. But for me, I feel like where we add most value is where we have a sense of what the recommendations might need to be, and whether or not we're able to deliver it as a council. it is of no use to us to just delve into something that we're just going to discover is an absolute minefield and there's nothing we can do about it. But something that we feel that we might have anecdotal, personal experience of through casework, personal experience, where we think, do you know what, this is something that if we just tweaked it a bit, we might be able to get something. And if we don't know, then we can do an exploratory piece of work just to get a sense of what something looks like and pick it up again in a future year, as we have done previously. Okay, so I think that's probably it for that item.
Yeah. We probably just at some point, quite urgent this week, but we need to agree the items for September, because that's could be coming quite soon for officers. So we might need to do a bit quicker piece of work with that. But we'll be in contact with members this week just to agree what that might look like. So, but also just to thank on record for everyone who kind of contributed, so the public who contributed to suggestions, so officers and other stakeholders who contributed such a wide range of suggestions, which gives us kind of real rich kind of opportunity to look through and prioritise and work across.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to everybody who contributed, including those of you here today. So item 10, very briefly, minutes of the last meeting. So minutes of the meetings held on the 19th of January, 28th of Feb and 14th of March are in the agenda pack. Can members note and agree the minutes?
Agreed.
Thank you. And then item 10, any other business? The next meeting is the 8th of September, as has been mentioned. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chair. Dead on time.